Zohran Mamdani's victory in New York City's mayoral race has sent shockwaves through American politics, marking a dramatic shift in the nation's largest metropolis and signaling a broader democratic resurgence that caught many observers by surprise. The 34-year-old self-described socialist became the first Muslim mayor in New York's history, after a campaign that explicitly challenged both conservative politics and centrist democratic incrementalism, positioning himself as what supporters call an anti-Trump figure who refuses to moderate his progressive vision for political convenience. The victory speech itself became a viral moment when Mamdani directly addressed President Trump, saying, "I know you're watching, so turn up the volume," before outlining a vision for New York that stood in stark contrast to the federal administration's priorities. This confrontational approach energized progressive activists who have felt defensive since Trump's return to power, transforming what could have been a routine local election into a symbolic battleground over competing visions of American identity and governance. Mamdani's campaign focused relentlessly on bread-and-butter issues affecting working-class New Yorkers, particularly housing affordability and immigrant rights, two areas where he promised immediate action despite federal opposition. His identity as an immigrant who came to America as a child resonated deeply in a city where millions share similar stories, and his unapologetic embrace of democratic socialist principles attracted younger voters frustrated with traditional democratic caution on economic issues. Political analysts note that Mamdani managed to build a coalition spanning progressive activists, immigrant communities, young professionals, and working-class voters of all backgrounds who felt left behind by decades of gentrification and rising inequality. The election results revealed significant shifts in New York's political geography, with Mamdani performing strongly, not just in traditionally progressive neighborhoods, but also in working-class areas that had shown signs of drifting toward Republicans in recent cycles. His message about making New York affordable for ordinary people, rather than just the wealthy, cut across demographic lines in ways that surprised political veterans who expected a more fragmented electorate. The campaign's sophisticated ground game, built largely through grassroots organizing rather than traditional party machinery, demonstrated that progressive candidates can win decisively when they articulate clear economic populist messages without hedging or apologizing. Trump's reaction came swiftly through social media, where he dismissed Mamdani as a communist and questioned the intelligence of Jewish voters who supported him, comments that immediately became controversial and dominated national news cycles. The president's rhetoric reflected a broader conservative strategy of portraying any progressive governance as radical extremism, but it also revealed anxiety about what a successful Mamdani administration might mean for political dynamics heading into the midterm elections. Republicans had hoped that local Democratic struggles would continue giving them momentum, but Mamdani's victory alongside other Democratic wins in state and local races across the country suggested a more complicated political landscape than many conservatives anticipated. Beyond New York, political observers see Mamdani's election as potentially representing a template for democratic revival in urban America, where progressive candidates who refuse to run away from bold policy proposals might energize voters more effectively than cautious centrists. The question now becomes whether Mamdani can govern as boldly as he campaigned, implementing progressive policies in a city that remains home to global financial institutions and wealthy residents who wield enormous influence. His announcement of an all-female senior staff sent an immediate signal about priorities and representation, but the real tests will come when he confronts entrenched interests over housing policy, police reform, and economic redistribution. President Trump's initial response to Mamdani's victory threatened immediate federal retaliation, with suggestions that New York might lose federal funding and face administrative obstacles from Washington. But within days, the rhetoric softened into something more ambiguous and potentially more strategically calculated. Trump's statement that he might help a little maybe and wanted to see how a communist does in New York represented a tactical shift that reflects complex political calculations about how aggressively to confront a popular newly elected mayor in America's media capital without creating a sympathetic underdog narrative that could benefit Democrats nationally. The president's allies privately acknowledged that previous attempts to punish Democratic cities through federal funding cuts ran into legal obstacles and political backlash, creating martyrs rather than forcing compliance with administration priorities. Trump's own experience during his first term showed that while presidential rhetoric can dominate news cycles, Actually, withholding congressionally appropriated funds from major cities triggers immediate lawsuits and often fails in court, leaving the administration looking impotent rather than powerful. This institutional reality appears to have influenced the more cautious approach emerging from the White House, where advisors recognize that turning Mamdani into a victim of federal overreach might strengthen rather than weaken his political position. Conservative analysts watching the situation argue that Trump should allow Mamdani to implement his progressive agenda without federal interference, believing that socialist policies will fail on their own terms and provide Republicans with powerful campaign material about democratic governance. This perspective holds that the best political outcome for conservatives would be letting New York become what they see as a cautionary tale about progressive overreach, with rising crime, business flight, and fiscal crisis vindicating conservative warnings about the dangers of left-wing economics. The tension between this patient strategy and Trump's instinct for immediate confrontation creates uncertainty about how the federal-municipal relationship will actually develop over coming months. Democrats see the situation differently, arguing that Trump's initial threats revealed authoritarian impulses to punish political opponents through government power, and that any moderation in his approach reflects weakness rather than strategic wisdom. Mamdani himself has positioned his mayoralty as a test case for whether local progressive governance can succeed despite federal hostility, framing the relationship with Washington as essentially adversarial and promising New Yorkers that he will protect them from Trump administration policies on immigration, environmental regulation, and social programs. This combative posture energizes his progressive base, but creates practical governance challenges in a system where cities depend heavily on federal resources and cooperation. The economic stakes involve billions in federal funding that flows to New York for transportation, housing, education, and social services, making it practically impossible for the Trump administration to impose meaningful financial pressure without congressional authorization that seems unlikely given political realities. However, the administration controls regulatory agencies that can make life difficult for city initiatives through permitting delays, environmental reviews, and bureaucratic obstacles that don't require dramatic funding cuts, but can slow or derail municipal priorities. This regulatory warfare represents a more plausible threat than wholesale funding termination, and one that could unfold largely outside public view, while creating real obstacles to Mamdani's agenda. Trump's comment that Mamdani should be very nice to me revealed the transactional nature of his approach to governance, suggesting that cooperative mayors receive better treatment than confrontational ones regardless of party or ideology. This explicitly political use of federal power troubles constitutional scholars who argue that government resources should flow based on legal criteria rather than personal relationships with the president. But it reflects how Trump has consistently approached executive authority throughout his political career. Whether Mamdani chooses engagement or continued confrontation will significantly shape his ability to deliver on campaign promises that often require federal partnership. Zoran Mamdani now faces the immense challenge of translating campaign rhetoric into governing reality in a city whose economy depends heavily on industries and individuals fundamentally opposed to socialist redistribution, creating tensions that will test whether progressive politics can succeed in America's financial capital, or whether structural constraints will force moderation and compromise. His promise to make housing affordable through aggressive rent regulations and public housing construction confronts a real estate industry with enormous political influence and legal resources, while his commitment to protecting undocumented immigrants sets up potential confrontations with federal immigration enforcement that could become flashpoints in the broader national debate. The announcement of an all-female senior leadership team represented an immediate signal about representation and priorities, drawing praise from progressive activists who see descriptive representation as essential to good governance, while prompting questions about whether gender became the primary qualification criterion in ways that might limit the administration's effectiveness. Mamdani's defenders argue that New York has an abundance of qualified women leaders who have been systematically excluded from top positions, making this correction long overdue rather than any kind of compromise on competence or experience. The composition of this team will face intense scrutiny as it tackles issues from police reform to climate change that require both political skill and technical expertise. Housing policy represents perhaps the most immediate test of whether Mamdani can deliver material improvements for working-class New Yorkers, or whether market forces and legal constraints will limit what's actually achievable through municipal action. His campaign promised aggressive rent control expansion, taxes on vacant luxury properties, and massive public housing construction, an agenda that immediately sparked concerns among developers and landlords who argue that such policies will reduce housing supply and drive up costs rather than solving affordability problems. The economic debate over these questions involves genuinely complex trade-offs rather than simple progressive versus conservative talking points, and how Mamdani navigates those complexities will determine whether his administration becomes a model or a cautionary tale. Immigration policy creates even more direct federal-state tensions, as Mamdani has promised to strengthen New York's sanctuary city protections and actively resist Trump administration deportation efforts in ways that could trigger constitutional confrontations over federal supremacy and immigration enforcement. The practical question involves how much a mayor can actually do to protect undocumented residents when federal agencies have independent authority to conduct enforcement operations, and whether activist resistance to ICE creates political benefits that outweigh the risks of federal retaliation through other channels. Immigrant advocacy groups expect Mamdani to prove that local governments can meaningfully resist federal immigration policies, setting up potential crises that could define his mayoralty. Wall Street's relationship with a socialist mayor presents fascinating political theater and real economic stakes, as financial firms represent both a crucial tax base that funds city services and an industry whose practices Mamdani has consistently criticized as predatory and exploitative. Major financial institutions are already signaling concerns about potential tax increases and regulatory burdens, with some suggesting they might accelerate the shift toward remote work arrangements that could reduce their physical presence in the city. Whether these threats represent genuine business decisions or political pressure tactics remains unclear, but they create real fiscal constraints on how aggressively Mamdani can pursue redistribution without triggering capital flight that would undermine his revenue base. The broader national implications of Mamdani's mayoralty extend well beyond New York, as Democrats desperately seek evidence that progressive governance can succeed and deliver tangible improvements in people's lives, rather than just symbolic victories and rhetorical radicalism. If Mamdani's administration reduces homelessness, makes housing more affordable, and improves city services while standing up to Trump, it would provide a roadmap for progressive candidates nationwide and potentially shift the Democratic Party's center of gravity leftward. Conversely, if his tenure is marked by rising disorder, business flight, and fiscal crisis, Republicans will cite New York as proof that progressive policies fail when confronted with reality, potentially discrediting the broader democratic socialist movement for years to come.